The sound of crystal against marble is something I'll never forget, sharp and humiliating, like the moment split open the air around me. My champagne glass had slipped right out of my hand and shattered at my feet, but the real damage came from the words floating above that noise. My brand new daughter-in-law leaned toward her parents with that sugary little smile of hers and said, "Clear enough for everyone nearby to hear. This is the family embarrassment we're stuck with." Crystal's manicured hand grazed my shoulder like I was an afterthought, a speck on her perfect day. The whole reception froze. You could have heard the band lose a beat as 200 people turned to stare at me. The 55-year-old woman in the simple navy dress who didn't quite belong. And then I noticed her father, William Caldwell, his face draining of color faster than I thought possible, like he'd seen a ghost wearing pearls. My skin prickled under all those eyes, the smell of gardenias from the centerpiece suddenly cloying, almost suffocating. Margot Caldwell, sitting beside her husband, lifted her jeweled hand to her throat in that dramatic way women do when they're deciding whether to gasp or smirk. Even my neighbor from the condo complex, Mrs. Fowler, who'd been invited as a courtesy, caught my eye with that pitying look that says, "Poor you, honey, but offers no rescue." Let me stop here and tell you who I am, because if I don't, none of what comes next will make sense. My name is Vivian Harper. Most people just call me Viv. I've been a widow for nearly 5 years, and if I've learned anything in that time, it's how to make myself invisible when I need to. I got good at it too, almost proud of how ordinary I could look. Department store dresses, an old reliable car, just enough to suggest I lived on my husband's pension and a bit of savings. People saw what they wanted to see, and I let them. It kept Chris safe. It kept me safe, or so I believed. Christopher, my only son, had been with Crystal just 8 months when this wedding became a runaway train I couldn't stop. I'd met her twice before. 2 polite dinners where she smiled too wide while asking if I was comfortable on my own or if I might need support as I got older. I laughed it off at the time, but it left a sting. Now here I was, standing in her family's estate in Greenwich, 50 acres of trimmed hedges and rose gardens straight out of Architectural Digest. Their chapel gleamed like something flown in from Europe, and every chair sparkled with ribbon. Crystal glided down the aisle in a gown that probably cost as much as a small house, and Chris looked radiant, happier than I'd seen him since the day we buried his father. I'd thought my simple navy dress and grandmother's pearls would be safe, respectful, invisible. But invisibility doesn't protect you when someone decides to make you their target. I thought I had done everything right that day. Nothing flashy, nothing that would stir up whispers or side glances. I slipped into that navy dress because it didn't shout, it just blended, and I clasped the pearls my grandmother once wore because they meant family to me, not money. I've known for years that the safest way to move through the world is to let people see exactly what they expect. A widow living quietly off her husband's pension, maybe a little life insurance, nothing more. People are comfortable when you fit the box they've already built in their heads, and I'd gotten so good at staying in mine that it became second nature. But still, as I stood at that chapel doorway and saw Margot Caldwell sizing me up from her front row seat, lips tight, like she was smelling something sour, I knew she'd already decided I didn't quite measure up to their picture-perfect world. The ceremony itself was breathtaking. I won't deny it. The Caldwells had spared no expense, and you could tell the planners had been given a blank check. Ice sculptures taller than me stood glistening at each corner of the ballroom, the kind of thing that melts into puddles long before dessert, but makes everyone gasp when they walk in. A 12-piece orchestra filled the air with sweeping music so polished it made me ache a little, remembering the cheap vinyl records my late husband and I used to dance to in our tiny living room. And the flowers. Good Lord, the flowers. The scent of lilies and roses was so thick it clung to my skin even when I stepped outside later that night, almost overwhelming in its perfection, like they'd tried to bury every insecurity under blossoms. I found myself a seat at a corner table, partly because I prefer the edges of rooms, and partly because I wanted to watch Chris without interruption. My boy was 32 now, a man with responsibilities and titles, but in that moment, spinning Crystal across the polished floor, he looked like the carefree kid who used to twirl his little cousins at family cookouts, grinning until his cheeks hurt. My chest swelled with love and a little grief, too, knowing his father would never see him like this. I kept my hands folded in my lap, listening to the clinking of champagne flutes and the rustle of silk gowns, telling myself that if I just stayed quiet, this day would pass peacefully. But peace wasn't what Crystal had in mind. She drifted toward me, her parents in tow, moving with that stage-practiced grace of someone used to being the center of every room. "Mom and Dad," she said, in a tone so sweet it nearly made my teeth ache, "I want you to meet Chris's mother." And it was in that instant, right there between the soft music and the murmurs of 200 guests, that the words tumbled out of her mouth, words that would split everything wide open and change the shape of my life forever. I will never forget the look on William Caldwell's face when his glass froze mid-air, the champagne trembling just below his lips as though time itself had stuttered. His eyes locked on mine, sharp with recognition, and I felt my stomach flip so hard I thought I might be sick, right there in front of everyone. "Vivian Harper," he breathed, my name escaping like a secret dragged out into the open. In that single moment, the disguise I had worn for years shattered as easily as the glass I'd dropped earlier. It was like the air got sucked right out of the room. He leaned forward, voice low but slicing clean through the hum of music and chatter. "Aren't you the woman from that Caldwell Tech acquisition? The one who bought my company?" My knees went weak under me. The whole crowd seemed to blur, but his words rang clear, cutting straight through the orchestra's strings. Crystal, who only minutes before had smirked at me like I was beneath her, went pale, her lips parting as she looked back and forth between her father and me. That smug certainty she carried like perfume drained right off her face. Margot Caldwell's jeweled bracelet caught the chandelier light as she lifted her hand to her throat, eyes darting between me and her husband. I could almost hear the wheels turning in her head, recalculating the social math she'd built so carefully. This was the part that always amused me in a bitter kind of way. People think they know what wealth looks like. They picture flashy cars, sparkling gowns, diamonds that blind from across the room. They don't expect it to show up in the form of a woman in a department store dress and an old sedan parked discreetly outside. That invisibility had been my shield for 15 years, and it all began with my late husband, Thomas. Back when we were just two overworked engineers in Silicon Valley, we had no idea we were building the cornerstone of a fortune. Tom's invention in 2010, a small piece of power management technology, seemed like nothing more than a clever idea at the time. Something to maybe give us an easier retirement, a little safety net after years of paychecks stretched too thin. I remember him leaning across our cluttered kitchen table, schematics spread everywhere, smelling of solder and burnt coffee, telling me he thought we might finally be onto something. Neither of us knew that what he'd created would end up revolutionizing how every smartphone battery in the world lasted longer. We thought we were lucky to dream of comfort. We didn't realize we were sitting on a gold mine. When that patent finally sold in 2012, the number nearly knocked the wind out of us. $22 million. I can still see the disbelief on Tom's face as he printed out the contract and spread it across our kitchen table, hands trembling just slightly like he didn't trust his own eyes. Chris was 24 back then, fresh out of grad school with his shiny marketing degree, full of that restless hunger to prove himself. He had no idea what was happening behind the scenes, and that was deliberate. Tom and I made a choice that day, a choice that would shape every decision we made for the next 13 years. We told Chris a softer version of the truth. We said we'd received a comfortable settlement, enough to live securely, enough to make sure he never had to worry about us. He never pressed. Probably figured it was a couple million tucked away. Nothing extravagant. And in a way, I let him believe that because I wanted him to earn his own way, not grow up with the weight of our windfall sitting on his shoulders. What he never realized was that the $22 million was just the seed, the very beginning of something far larger. Tom and I threw ourselves into investing like it was a second career. At first, we stayed safe, blue-chip stocks, stable as old oak trees. But Tom had this uncanny gift, almost like a sixth sense, for seeing where the market would shift before anyone else did. He could look at a struggling little company or a patch of forgotten real estate and see what it might become. We moved into growth stocks, then tech startups with real fundamentals. And I remember nights when we'd sit cross-legged on the living room rug, laptops open, coffee gone cold, arguing over whether a biotech firm in Boston was worth the risk. Those were some of the most alive years of my marriage. Building something side by side, not glamorous, but powerful. By the time cancer took him in 2020, what we'd built together had swelled to more than $800 million. $800 million. It still makes my head spin to say it out loud. And that fortune, carefully guarded behind shell companies and legal walls, was the very same money I used to acquire Caldwell Tech 2 years after Tom's death. The irony still makes me shake my head. While Crystal tilted her head at me with those concerned little smiles, asking if I needed help managing my finances, I was quietly the one who had stepped in to rescue her father's sinking company, the one he had nearly destroyed with reckless expansion and suffocating debt. He thought he was selling to some faceless investment firm. He never imagined the real face belonged to the quiet woman in pearls sitting across the table. Under my watch, that company had clawed its way back to life, steadied by structure, not flash, guided by discipline. Tom and I had practiced for years. It was almost poetic. The same woman Crystal had mocked as an embarrassment was the very one keeping her family's empire from collapsing completely. I remember forcing a faint smile that night, looking William Caldwell straight in the eye and murmuring, "I think you must have me confused with someone else." My voice was calm, but we both knew it was a lie. I saw the flicker of recognition in his eyes, that sharp memory of the boardroom where I'd sat quietly while my attorneys did the talking. He hadn't even bothered to look at me then, assuming I was just a wife tagging along for the formalities. But now the truth hung between us, undeniable. Crystal's eyes darted from her father to me, alarm replacing the smugness that had been plastered on her face all evening. Margot stiffened in her chair, the hand on her throat trembling just slightly. For years I had hidden behind discretion like armor, and in one careless moment it all cracked wide open. I slipped out of the estate quietly that night, clutching my wrap around me like it could shield me from the storm I knew was coming. I told anyone who asked that I was simply exhausted. But the truth was I needed to think, to breathe, to figure out how to protect the life I'd built when my cover had just been ripped away in front of 200 strangers. The next morning, I sat in my small but warm apartment, the one with the creaky floorboards and the sun that always caught the corner of my kitchen counter just right. My favorite mug of coffee steamed between my palms, its chipped rim grounding me as if to remind me I was still me, still ordinary on the outside. I hadn't slept a wink. I kept replaying William's expression, that pale shock on his face, and the panic flashing across Crystal's eyes like she'd just realized she might have married into something far more complicated than she bargained for. At 7 sharp, the phone rang. Chris's voice came at me, tight and urgent. No trace of the joyful groom I'd seen just hours earlier. By 8, He was pacing my living room like a caged animal, running his hands through his hair the exact same way he used to when he was a boy, frustrated over a broken toy. "Mom, you have to help me understand what happened last night," he demanded, his eyes pleading but edged with suspicion. He told me William had cornered him after I left, asking questions that dug uncomfortably close to the truth. Questions about Dad's patents, about my investments, about whether our family was hiding something. I listened quietly, my coffee suddenly bitter in my mouth, knowing the time for silence was running out. 15 years of walls I'd built around my life had cracked wide open in a single evening, and the sound of that fracture was still echoing in my chest. I sat there clutching my mug like it was a lifeline, watching Chris wear a path into my rug with his restless pacing. He carried his father's intensity in his blood, but he used it differently. Tom had been measured, deliberate, like a man playing chess 3 moves ahead. Chris, though, he was fire. He burned hot, direct, emotional, and in that moment his energy filled the room until I could hardly breathe. "What kind of questions?" I asked, though my stomach already knew the answer. He stopped pacing and looked at me, those steady brown eyes so much like Tom's locking onto mine, and I swear for a second I saw the boy he used to be, stubborn, desperate for truth. He wanted to know about Dad's patents, about whether you've been involved in big deals, about where our family really stands financially. My heart clenched. Chris's voice dropped lower, like he couldn't quite believe his own words. "Mom, he seemed to think you were some kind of major investor." It was bizarre. The bitterness in my coffee suddenly tasted sharper, like guilt had seeped into it. This was the moment I'd been both dreading and preparing for, the conversation I knew would eventually come. My son had built his career the hard way, brick by brick. Senior marketing manager at a reputable firm, his position earned by 60-hour weeks, clever campaigns, and the kind of grit you can't fake. He'd scraped and saved for his house, cutting corners, packing lunches, living the values Tom and I had preached. Hard work, integrity, living within your means. I had wanted that for him. I had fought to protect that. And yet, sitting there, I felt like a fraud. How could I explain that while he was sweating through late nights at the office? I could have bought his entire company without blinking. That while he was pinching pennies for a down payment, I was moving millions in and out of portfolios worth more than entire towns? My chest ached with the weight of secrets I'd carried too long. I set the mug down and forced my voice soft. "Chris," I said, gesturing to the couch, "sit down. There are things you need to know." I had just opened my mouth to start explaining when my phone buzzed on the counter. A text lit up the screen, and my stomach tightened the second I saw her name, Crystal. I didn't even need to read the message to know what it would say. "Vivian, I think we should have lunch today. There are some things Chris and I would like to discuss with you." I turned the phone so my son could see, and his face shifted from confusion to a kind of wary concern I hadn't seen on him since he was a boy caught sneaking in past curfew. "What do you think she wants?" he asked. But I already knew Crystal Caldwell wasn't the kind of woman who let mysteries lie untouched, especially if money might be tangled inside them. I could picture her lying awake all night, peppering William with questions, her mind racing through family stories and corporate rumors, weaving her own theory. And the real question haunting me was, how much had William pieced together in those few tense minutes back in that boardroom years ago? I looked at Chris and said quietly, "Your wife is more observant than we've given her credit for." A beat later, his phone lit up with her name. He answered instantly, and even from across the room I could hear her voice. Bright, too cheerful, that brittle kind of sweetness that comes when someone's already 3 steps ahead in a game. "Darling, I was hoping we could all have lunch today. There are family things I'd just love to talk over with your mother now that we're officially relatives." By the time we walked into the restaurant, she'd been there 45 minutes already. Of course she had. She'd chosen the most expensive place in town, the kind of place where the waiters glide instead of walk, and the walls are lined with wine bottles worth more than most people's mortgages. Crystal had claimed the corner table with the best view of the entire room, her blonde hair catching the sunlight like it was staged. She stood when she saw us, arms outstretched, as though we were beloved friends instead of her latest project. "Vivian, Chris, thank you for meeting me," she sang, lips stretched into that radiant smile. But her eyes, sharp, calculating, already cataloging my off-the-rack black dress and modest jewelry, told the real story. She waved to the waiter with a little flick of her manicured fingers. "I ordered us a nice bottle of Bordeaux to celebrate being family," she announced, her tone so casual it could have fooled anyone who didn't know better. The bottle, I later saw on the menu, cost more than a month's worth of groceries. She wasn't just drinking wine. She was sending a message about what kind of life she expected to step into now. I smiled politely, settling into my chair. "This is lovely, dear," I said, my voice steady, though my chest was tight, though perhaps a little extravagant for a casual family lunch. Her smile didn't falter an inch. "Oh, I don't think anything about our family is casual anymore," she replied, her voice smooth as glass. "I spent some time last night talking with Daddy about his business experiences. He shared the most fascinating stories about acquisitions and anonymous investors." Chris sat between us, his eyes darting from my face to Crystal's, trying to read a conversation happening in a language he didn't understand. "Crystal, what does this have to do with lunch?" he asked, his voice tight. She barely even looked at him. Her eyes stayed locked on me, sharp and unblinking. "You know, Vivian, I majored in business at Wharton," she began like a professor about to give a lecture. "Corporate finance has always fascinated me, especially the way shell companies and discrete investors structure things. My father mentioned once that when Caldwell Tech was acquired, the buyer was unusually private." She tilted her head, smiling like a cat who'd found the cream. I didn't flinch. I let her go first. She leaned in slightly, her perfume brushing the air between us, her voice taking on that conspiratorial lilt of someone about to reveal a juicy secret. "The interesting thing about discreet investors," she continued, "is that they usually have very good reasons for staying out of the spotlight. Reasons like having substantial wealth they'd rather not parade around." I swirled the wine in my glass and said evenly, "That sounds reasonable." My calmness only seemed to fuel her. She pressed forward, her eyes glinting. Daddy remembered the woman at that acquisition meeting. Quiet, elegant, deferring to her attorneys, but he said she carried herself like someone used to making real decisions. I felt Chris's eyes burning into me then. He looked at me like puzzle pieces were finally clicking together, though he didn't want to believe what they spelled out. "Mom?" he whispered, voice raw. Before I could open my mouth, Crystal pulled out her phone with a flourish. She turned the screen toward us, and there it was. A grainy news photo from 3 years ago, the Caldwell Tech signing ceremony. A cluster of lawyers and executives filled most of the frame, but in the corner, half obscured, stood a woman in a navy dress. The posture, the pearls, even the way the purse strap crossed her shoulder. It was unmistakable. "The resolution isn't great," she said lightly, tapping the screen, "but the resemblance is uncanny. The way she stands, the height, the presence. Almost identical to you, Vivian." Her smile sharpened, all edges now as silence swelled thick between us. Chris set his glass down with shaking hands, his face pale. "Mom," he said again, his voice cracking, "please tell me, you're not who she thinks you are." I looked at my son. This man I had raised on honesty and grit, this man who had no idea how much I'd hidden for his sake. And I felt the weight of every secret pressing down. "Chris," I whispered, my throat dry, "there are things about your father's work and our investments that I never told you." Crystal's triumph radiated across the table, every line of her perfect face savoring the moment. But as I watched her gloat, I couldn't help wondering if she had any idea what storm she had just stirred awake. 3 days later, I was in Stephen Grant's downtown office, staring at neat stacks of documents on polished mahogany, the hum of the city bleeding in from 20 floors below, trying to figure out how far this was going to go and how I was going to stop it. The lunch with Chris and Crystal had ended in a storm I couldn't calm. My son had walked out red-faced, furious at the half-truths I'd finally admitted, and his new wife had lingered behind just long enough to sprinkle her suggestions about family planning and shared responsibilities like sugar over poison. By the next morning, I knew I couldn't waste time. I needed to understand exactly where I stood, and more importantly, what she thought she could take from me. That's how I found myself in Stephen Grant's office downtown, staring at the shine of his mahogany desk while he pushed his glasses up the bridge of his nose. "Vivian, I have to say, this is an unusual request," he murmured, flipping through the file I'd asked him to compile. His voice carried that practiced calm that financial advisors wear like armor, but even he couldn't hide his surprise. "Why the sudden interest in your daughter-in-law's family background?" I told him what I should have admitted days earlier, that the company I'd acquired, Caldwell Tech, wasn't just any distressed asset I'd rescued. It was Crystal's birthright, the empire her father had nearly bankrupted with his overreach. Stephen's eyebrows shot up and he let out a low whistle. "Your daughter-in-law? The same Crystal who just married your son?" When I nodded, he shook his head slowly, almost impressed. "Well, that's complicated." He turned to his computer, pulling up spreadsheets and charts with the efficiency of a surgeon laying out instruments. "Let's walk through this chronologically. In 2019, William Caldwell went on a buying spree, gobbling up smaller competitors, betting on growth. When the economy tightened in 2021, the debt crushed them. Caldwell Tech was bleeding cash. I remembered the acquisition well. I'd seen the numbers, the bones of a company that was worth saving. I bought it at a discount, not out of malice, but strategy. And in doing so, I unknowingly cut off the future Crystal had been groomed for. She'd spent summers working there, earned her MBA with the promise of stepping into her father's shoes, and had bragged to anyone who'd listen that she would soon be running the company. Stephen clicked into another file. By bringing in new management, you didn't just restructure a business, you erased her career path. More than that, you eliminated what she considered her birthright. He looked up at me then, and something in his eyes made my stomach twist. And here's where it gets interesting. I've been monitoring some discreet inquiries. Someone's been digging into your investments, asking about shell corporations, acquisition structures, anonymous buyers. The room seemed to close in on me. My palms went damp against the cool leather armrests. "What kind of questions?" I asked, though I already feared the answer. "Professional-level questions," Stephen said flatly. "This isn't casual curiosity. Whoever's behind it knows what to look for, and they're motivated. My guess? Your daughter-in-law has hired a private investigator." The words landed like a stone in my gut. 15 years of carefully layered discretion, the walls Tom and I had built brick by brick to shield our fortune and protect our son, could be dismantled by a woman with sharp cheekbones, a Wharton degree, and enough entitlement to believe she was owed the life I'd built in silence. Stephen slid a thick folder across the desk, his fingers resting on it like he knew I wouldn't like what was inside. "Vivian, the Caldwell family isn't as stable as they want people to believe," he said, his voice steady but serious. "They've been keeping up appearances with credit and loans, stretching everything thin, waiting for some kind of miracle. When you bought Caldwell Tech, you didn't just pick up a business. You picked up what Crystal thought was her inheritance." My stomach dropped at those words. I hadn't even realized it at the time, but it explained so much. The sharp way Margot had looked at me, the bitterness in William's eyes, the desperation hiding under Crystal's perfect smile. He clicked through spreadsheets on his computer, each chart making the picture darker. Back in 2019, William borrowed heavily to buy out smaller competitors, and when the market tightened, they couldn't keep up with the debt. By 2021, they were barely keeping the lights on. I remembered those months, the way I'd studied the numbers and seen a company with good bones buried under bad management. "You stepped in at the perfect time," Stephen continued, "and with professional oversight, the business bounced back. But what you didn't see was that you erased Crystal's career path. She was supposed to take over. She spent her summers working there, got her MBA with that future in mind. In her eyes, you didn't just buy the company, you stole her place in it." I leaned back in the chair, feeling the weight of it all pressing down. For Crystal, this wasn't just about money, it was personal. It was about power, legacy, and the life she thought she was promised. Stephen pulled another file onto the desk and tapped it. Here's where it gets interesting. Someone has been asking questions, very specific ones, about shell corporations, hidden ownership structures, anonymous investors. These aren't the kind of questions nosy neighbors ask. This is professional-level digging. My guess, your daughter-in-law hired someone to investigate you. My chest tightened as I stared at the folder, the numbers and names blurring together. 15 years of careful planning, all the walls Tom and I had built to protect our fortune and keep Chris's life clean could unravel because one ambitious young woman decided she was owed what wasn't hers. It wasn't just money anymore. It was a hunt, and I was the target. Stephen didn't sugarcoat it. He leaned across his desk and said, "Vivian, the Caldwell's financial situation is a lot shakier than it looks. They've been holding up their lifestyle with loans and credit, hoping William would land another big deal or that Crystal would marry into money. And now in her mind, she has—" The words sank deep because they explained everything. The urgency in William's eyes, the sharpness in Margot's judgment, and the way Crystal clung to Chris as if he were an investment as much as a husband. "Exactly," Stephen went on. "And if they're planning to rope you into this, through family obligations or by pushing for access to your investments, you'd better be ready. This won't be a polite chat around a dinner table. This is going to be a campaign." I left his office with those words echoing in my ears. 15 years earlier, Tom and I had made the choice to stay quiet, to shield Chris from the weight of our wealth. But walking out into the crisp downtown air that day, I realized the choice had come back around. And this time, the stakes weren't just about protecting his independence. This time, it was about protecting everything we had built from being twisted and used against us. That evening, I reached for something I hadn't touched in months, a bottle of wine Tom and I had saved for anniversaries or milestones. I poured myself a heavy glass, the deep red catching the kitchen light, and carried it to the dining table. Then I spread out folders and binders, 15 years of financial records laid open across the wood. If Crystal thought she was clever enough to play detective, she was about to find out she had picked the wrong person to underestimate. The table looked like a war map, numbers and notes stretching out like battle lines. The story those papers told was one even I had nearly forgotten. It wasn't luck. It wasn't just Tom's patent sale. It was long nights of research, steady choices, diversification, and reinvesting every profit into the next opportunity. $22 million had grown to $50 million by 2015, then $200 million by 2018, and by the time cancer took Tom in 2020, we had crossed $800 million. I hadn't just preserved it, I'd grown it. And as I looked at the records, I realized I wasn't just sitting on money. I was sitting on a network, a foundation of influence and innovation spread across industries, something far bigger than wealth itself. When I looked over the files, the truth of it hit me harder than I expected. I wasn't just sitting on a pile of money. I held serious stakes in a dozen companies, licensing rights on 17 technologies, and my reach stretched into everything from renewable energy to biotech. These weren't just numbers on a page. They were doors into the future, and I had keys to all of them. Even Stephen, with all his knowledge, didn't fully see how deeply I was tied into the machinery of innovation. My phone buzzed just as I was closing one folder. It was a text from Chris. Mom, Crystal, and I want to come over tomorrow evening. She has some ideas about how our family should handle this new information. I had to bite back a laugh. Ideas? I could picture them already. Trust funds, family councils, maybe some neatly packaged plan where my years of sacrifice got repurposed into Crystal's vision of a dynasty. She thought she was clever, but she had no idea who she was up against. What Crystal didn't understand was that I'd been protecting and strategizing longer than she'd even been alive. Managing expectations wasn't new to me. It was second nature. I pulled closer the thick packet Stephen had given me, the one on the Caldwell's finances, and let the reality sink in. Their situation wasn't just shaky. It was fragile to the point of breaking. The numbers told the story. The family estate was mortgaged at 80% of its value. Their accounts drained year after year just to hold up the image of wealth, and their credit stacked high on the hope that William would someday cash in on old business favors. He had told himself he'd retired comfortably after selling his company, but the truth was brutal. The life they were showing off was built on borrowed time, and now Crystal was looking at me to refill what her father had lost. The truth about William's retirement was more tangled than even he understood. Most of his income didn't come from shrewd planning or careful savings. It came from consulting fees and cushy board positions I had quietly arranged through the new management team at Caldwell Tech. Without my continued ownership, his comfortable lifestyle would have cracked years ago, though I doubted he'd ever admit it. That irony wasn't lost on me. The same woman his daughter sneered at as an embarrassment was the one keeping the lights on in his home. But that was only the beginning. I opened my laptop, the glow spilling across stacks of paper and half a glass of wine, and started digging into Crystal's recent moves. If she had really hired a private investigator, there would be footprints, payments, calls, subtle shifts in her routine. It didn't take long. Within an hour, I had confirmation. She had retained a firm that specialized in corporate asset tracing, the kind of people who lived to untangle shell companies and hidden ownership. And as if that weren't enough, she'd also reached out to an attorney known for handling family wealth disputes. The deeper I went, the clearer the picture became. Crystal had opened multiple new lines of credit in the last month, and judging by the balances, she was funding her little project on borrowed money. She was betting everything on a payoff that hadn't materialized yet. My chest tightened as I stared at the evidence. She hadn't married Chris for love, no matter how sweetly she smiled in her wedding photos. She'd married him the same way her father bought companies, cold, calculated, and expecting returns. The wine made me bold, maybe a little too honest with myself, but the truth was overdue. For 15 years, I'd been the quiet widow in pearls, happy to let the world assume I lived comfortably but modestly, while in the shadows I built something vast. But Crystal's little performance at the reception had flipped a switch in me. I wasn't just tired of being underestimated, I was done with it. Tomorrow night, when Chris brought his wife to share her ideas about our family's future, I was going to give them both a lesson they would never forget about who exactly they had decided to investigate. By the time the knock came at my door, I'd already made up my mind. For 15 years, I had played the quiet widow, the careful investor, but that part of me was done. Tonight, I wasn't just Vivian Harper, mother and widow. I was the strategist who had spent a decade and a half winning games other people didn't even realize they were in. Chris and Crystal walked in together, both of them stiff and overly polite, carrying themselves like diplomats bracing for a fragile negotiation. I'd set the table with a small plate of cheese and fruit, opened a modest bottle of wine, and dimmed the lights just enough to keep things comfortable. Nothing extravagant, nothing that hinted at the arsenal sitting quietly in my accounts. "Mom, thank you for agreeing to sit down with us." Chris began, his voice soft but heavy, as though each word had to be weighed before it left his lips. I know the last few days have been complicated. He looked at me the way he always did when he was nervous, jaw tight, eyes darting like a child trying to read my mood. Crystal, on the other hand, had dressed the part of a professional. Dark business suit, heels planted firmly, portfolio clutched in her manicured hand. She took my chair without hesitation, arranging herself like the head of the table belonged to her. "Vivian," she started smoothly, her MBA training dripping from every word, "I want to begin by saying that everything we discuss tonight stays within the family. We're all on the same side here." Her smile was warm but rehearsed, the kind that showed teeth but hid intentions. I almost laughed at the presumption, but instead I nodded politely. "Of course, dear. What did you want to discuss?" She opened the portfolio, revealing neatly stacked documents, color-coded tabs, bullet points. She had prepared for this moment with the kind of intensity I used to bring to million-dollar negotiations. "Well," she continued, flipping to the first page, "after reflecting on our conversation at lunch, I realize we may have gotten off on the wrong foot. What I'd like to propose is a more collaborative approach to family financial planning." Chris shifted uncomfortably beside her, his knee bouncing under the table as if he could feel the trap being set. "Collaborative how?" I asked, keeping my voice calm, though I could already guess where this was heading. Crystal leaned forward, her tone sharpening into the polished cadence of a boardroom presentation. "The thing is, Vivian, I believe we could structure things in a way that benefits everyone involved." Crystal leaned forward with the poise of someone delivering a keynote, her voice smooth and rehearsed. "Family wealth works best when it's managed strategically across generations. David and I have been discussing how to create a structure that protects your privacy while still providing more transparency for family planning. And there it was, the true purpose of this visit, neatly packaged as concern, but driven by ambition. I didn't react. I simply lifted my glass, took a slow sip of wine, and let her keep talking. "We've been thinking about establishing a family foundation," she went on, sliding a packet of papers across the table toward me. "It would allow us to make charitable contributions, provide tax advantages, and streamline our investments." The boldness of it nearly made me laugh out loud. Less than a week ago, she'd been looking at me like I didn't belong in her world, and now she was presenting me with a business plan for how to spend the money she thought she'd uncovered. She wasn't finished. "I've already had some preliminary conversations with an attorney who specializes in family wealth management," she added brightly, like it was a detail that should impress me. The audacity of it was breathtaking. She had barely confirmed my financial reality and was already consulting lawyers, drafting documents, and building her case for a seat at the table. I kept my expression neutral, though inside I was cataloging every move she'd made, every assumption she'd revealed. "That sounds very thorough," I said calmly, and her face lit up as if she'd scored a victory. "The foundation would be controlled by a board of family trustees," she continued eagerly, her voice picking up speed. "You, me, David, and eventually any children we might have." I glanced at Chris, who sat stiffly beside her, clearly torn between loyalty and unease. Crystal's confidence filled the room like perfume, but what she didn't realize was that I'd been playing this game long before she was even out of school. Crystal's tone carried the calm assurance of someone already picturing herself in charge. It would give us all input into major financial decisions while maintaining proper oversight. Chris was staring at the papers spread out on the table, his face pale, his shoulders tense. "Crystal, maybe we should slow down," he said softly. "This is a lot to process." I leaned back, folded my hands around my wine glass, and kept my voice steady. "Actually, Chris, I think your wife has put considerable thought into this proposal. Tell me, Crystal, what kind of initial funding were you imagining for this foundation?" Her eyes brightened immediately, mistaking my curiosity for agreement. "Well, that depends on the scope of our charitable work," she said, her tone suddenly animated. "But I was thinking we'd want something significant enough to establish credibility. Maybe 50 or 60 million to start." I nodded slowly, letting her words hang in the air. 50 or 60 million is a casual suggestion from the same woman who had stood in front of 200 guests a week earlier and called me a family embarrassment. "And the board structure you mentioned," I asked lightly, "how would the voting rights be allocated?" She didn't hesitate. "Equal representation makes the most sense. 3 trustees, 3 votes, very democratic." I set my glass down carefully and met her eyes. "Crystal, can I ask you something honestly?" She smiled thinly, clearly expecting another question about finances. "Of course." My voice dropped lower. "Do you love my son?" For the first time that night, she froze. Her gaze flickered to Chris and then back to me, her carefully polished composure slipping for just a second. "What kind of question is that?" she stammered. I didn't move, didn't soften. A simple one. "Do you love Chris for who he is, or do you love what you think being married to him can give you?" The silence that followed was heavier than anything money could buy. Chris shifted in his seat, his eyes bouncing between us, his chest rising with uneven breaths. Crystal opened her mouth, then closed it, scrambling to rebuild her mask. "I think that's an unfair characterization of our relationship," she said finally, her voice brittle, her confidence thinning around the edges. But the crack was there now, and no amount of training or polish could hide it from me, or from my son, who was beginning to see what I had seen all along. "Is it unfair?" I asked quietly, pushing back from the table and walking over to my bookshelf. My fingers found the folder I'd placed there earlier, the one I debated whether to use tonight. I brought it back, set it down in front of us, and opened it slowly, letting the papers fan out across the table. "Because I have some information that might help clarify things." Crystal's face drained of color the moment she saw the letterhead on the first page. Her hand twitched toward the papers like she could snatch them away, but I slid them closer instead. "This," I said evenly, tapping the top sheet, "is a record of your communications with Ashford Private Investigations over the last 2 weeks. According to their invoices, you hired them to dig into corporate ownership structures and track down anonymous investors. Not cheap, from what I can see." Chris leaned forward, confusion twisting into anger as he read. "Crystal," he said, his voice cracking, "you hired private investigators?" She rushed in immediately, words tumbling out too fast. "It's not what it sounds like." I was just trying to understand our family's financial picture better. I shook my head slowly. "No, you were building a case." I pulled another page free, laying it on top. "These records show you also contacted Harrison, Webb, and Associates. They specialize in family wealth disputes and trust litigation. That's not curiosity, Crystal. That's strategy." Her eyes darted to Chris, desperate for him to intervene, but he was staring at the documents like they were written in a language he wished he couldn't read. His silence pressed heavier on the room than any words could. "And this," I said, sliding one more document into view, "is a record of 3 new credit accounts you opened in the past month. All maxed, all tied to your name. Looks like you were borrowing against what you believed was your guaranteed future with my son." I sat back, folding my hands calmly in my lap. That's a bold assumption to make. Crystal's lips parted, searching for her usual polished reply, but nothing came. Her composure had shattered, her voice raw when she finally whispered, "Vivian, you have to understand." But whatever excuse she thought she could spin now, the mask was gone, and Chris was finally seeing the truth laid bare in front of him. "I was just trying to protect our family's interests," Crystal said quickly, her voice climbing higher with each word. I leaned forward, letting the weight of my silence stretch before answering. Whose interests, exactly? Because according to this profile Stephen prepared, your family's situation is far shakier than you've been letting on. I spread the documents across the coffee table, the pages whispering as they fanned out. Your parents' estate is mortgaged at nearly 80% of its value. Their accounts have been drained just to keep up appearances since your father lost Caldwell Tech. And most of what they live on now, I tapped a page. It comes from consulting contracts I arranged for William through the new management I installed. Chris leaned closer, scanning the papers, and I watched his expression unravel. Confusion giving way to anger, then to something heavier, something like heartbreak. "Mom," he said slowly, "how do you even know all this?" I held his gaze. Because when someone decides to investigate me, I make sure to investigate them back. And what I found is that your wife's family has been surviving on borrowed money and borrowed time for years. Crystal's lips parted, her face pale. "That doesn't change the fact that we're family now," she said shakily. "We should be working together instead of against each other." "You're right," I said, standing and moving toward the window, the city lights flickering just beyond the glass. "We should be working together." But the real question is, what kind of work did you have in mind? I turned back, my eyes steady. Because from where I sit, the moment you discovered I had money, you began planning how to access it. Not how to contribute, not how to build, but how to control it. That's not partnership, Crystal. That's a takeover. She stiffened, trying to protest. "That's not fair." I didn't flinch. "Isn't it?" I reached for one last document, sliding it across the table. This is a transcript of a phone call you had with your college roommate, 3 weeks before you even met Chris. In it, you said you were tired of dating men who couldn't provide financial security and that you were looking for someone from a stable family with long-term prospects. The silence that followed was sharp as glass. Chris stared at her like she was a stranger, while Crystal's eyes darted around the room, already calculating her retreat. I softened my tone, though my words cut clean. "Chris, you need to ask yourself if the woman you married is the person you thought she was." But even as I said it, I knew this was just the opening round. Crystal Caldwell wasn't built to surrender, and by exposing her, I'd shown her exactly how much she stood to lose. Chris moved back to his apartment after that night, saying he needed time to sort through everything, to figure out what was real and what was manipulation. He didn't say it, but I could feel the distance in his voice, the way he suddenly looked at me like I was a stranger he had to study before he could trust again. Crystal stormed out of my place with her heels clicking like gunshots against the floor, and before the door slammed shut, she made it clear she considered my words a declaration of war. I had thought she was ambitious, entitled, maybe reckless, but I hadn't understood just how dangerous she could be until the first signs came. It was Stephen Grant who called me that Friday morning, his voice tighter than I'd ever heard. "Vivian, we've got a problem," he said. "Someone's been contacting the SEC asking pointed questions about your investment structures." My stomach twisted before he even finished. This wasn't idle gossip anymore. These were professional inquiries, the kind that hinted at a coordinated effort to build a case. "What kind of case?" I asked, bracing myself. His answer was like a cold wave hitting me square in the chest. Failure to properly disclose beneficial ownership in public companies, possible insider trading tied to acquisitions, and questions about whether your shell entities have filed complete reports. He paused, and in that silence I could hear the weight of everything I'd spent years protecting. "Vivian, this isn't casual curiosity anymore. Someone's trying to push regulators to come after you. I didn't have to ask who. I already knew whose hand was behind it, whose ambition was sharp enough to cut straight through the life I'd built in secrecy. How serious is this?" My voice sounded steady, but my hands shook as I gripped the phone. "It depends," Stephen said carefully. "Your structures are legal, but they're complex, and complexity can look like deception when someone wants to spin it that way. If a complaint gets filed, you could be staring down months or even years of investigation. Even if you're cleared in the end, the costs will be staggering: money, time, reputation, and the privacy you've guarded for 15 years, that would be gone. His words echoed long after the call ended, leaving me in the kind of silence that felt louder than any threat Crystal could have spoken aloud. "What would you recommend?" I'd asked Stephen, my voice quieter than I meant. He didn't hesitate. "Honestly, end this before it gets worse. Whatever sparked this family fight, you need to settle it fast, because once regulators get involved, they almost never stop at the original complaint." His words followed me after I hung up, heavy as stones in my chest. I sat in my apartment staring at the half-empty coffee cup in front of me, weighing every option I had left. Crystal had gone from playing investigator to opening the door to legal warfare, and I could almost admire the ruthlessness of it. She wasn't just trying to expose me. She was trying to corner me into a settlement, betting I would pay to keep my privacy. The phone rang, breaking my thoughts. Chris's name lit the screen, and I answered, bracing myself. "Mom, we need to talk." "Something's happened." His voice sounded tired, hollow, older somehow. An hour later, he was at my door, shoulders slumped, dark circles under his eyes, looking far older than 32. He didn't bother with greetings. "Crystal filed for separation," he said flatly. "Her lawyer claims she's worried about financial liabilities tied to undisclosed family assets." The words hit me like a door slamming shut. For a moment, I almost admired her precision. Filing for separation gave her legal cover, shielding her from any fallout while setting the stage for divorce negotiations. It was calculated, careful, and cold. "I'm sorry, Chris," I said softly, reaching toward him, but he didn't move. His eyes held mine, and there was no anger in them, only something deeper, heavier, pain, disbelief. A son caught between the woman he had married and the mother he thought he knew. "Are you?" he asked, his voice breaking. "Because it feels like you wanted this. Like you pushed until my marriage cracked, just so you could prove your point about her." The accusation landed harder than anything Crystal had ever thrown at me. It wasn't sharp or cruel. It was raw and honest, and it cut straight through the armor I'd worn for years. I had prepared for Crystal's ambition, for lawyers and investigators and regulators. What I hadn't prepared for was the possibility of losing my son's trust in the process. "Chris, I never wanted your marriage to fall apart," I said, my voice shaking even though I tried to steady it. "I just wanted you to see clearly who you married before it was too late to make a choice with open eyes." He shook his head, anger flickering under the exhaustion on his face. By tearing her family's finances apart? By investigating her like she's a criminal? His words cut deep, but I forced myself to keep going. "I'm the same woman who raised you to value honesty and integrity. The same woman who wanted you to earn your success without leaning on family money." His laugh was bitter. "And look where that got me. My wife is leaving me. Her family's a mess. And now I find out my mother is some kind of secret corporate mogul who's been lying to me for 15 years. I wanted to reach for him, to bridge the gap with a hand on his shoulder the way I used to when he skinned his knee or broke a toy. But the distance between us was wider than it had ever been. "Chris," I said softly, "there's something else you need to know. Crystal has already filed complaints with federal regulators about my investment activities. She's trying to drag me into a legal war that will play out in public." His head snapped up, his eyes wide. "What does that even mean?" I held his gaze. "It means this isn't over. It's just beginning. And I need to know if you're with me or if you're going to stand aside and let her tear apart everything I built to protect our family." The silence stretched heavy between us, long enough that I felt the sting of tears behind my eyes. Finally, Chris looked up, and there was something different in his face. Not forgiveness, not yet, but maybe the first flicker of understanding. "What do you need me to do?" he asked quietly. Relief and sorrow washed over me at the same time. For the first time in days, I felt like there was a chance he might see me for who I really was, not just the secrets I had kept. The answer came sooner than either of us expected. By Monday morning, we were sitting across a long, polished table in Stephen Grant's conference room. On one side, me, with Chris beside me, still tense, but present. On the other, Crystal, her attorney Marcus Webb, and her parents, William and Margot Caldwell, dressed in sharp clothes and stony expressions. The air in the room was thick, brittle, ready to snap. Nobody touched the water glasses. Nobody smiled. We were past family dinners and polite conversation. This was war. "Let's be clear about why we're here," Alan Stone began, straightening his tailored suit as he spread a stack of documents across the mahogany conference table. His voice was smooth but sharp, designed to make everyone else in the room feel smaller. "My client has reason to believe that Mrs. Harper has concealed substantial assets while her son's wife's family has faced financial hardship. This points either to deliberate deception or to potential impropriety worthy of investigation." His words hung in the air like a charge, daring someone to disagree. Stephen Grant didn't miss a beat. Sitting beside me, he leaned forward just slightly, his calm presence filling the room. "Mr. Stone," he said, his voice level, "Mrs. Harper's financial activities are entirely legal and properly reported. The complaints your client filed with regulators don't read like legitimate concerns. They read like grievances driven by personal motives." His words landed with quiet force, a reminder that facts still mattered more than accusations. Crystal leaned in next, her body language all polish and control, but I could hear the strain under her tone. "This isn't about personal grievances," she said carefully. "This is about family responsibility and transparency. Vivian has been shaping people's lives while hiding behind an image that isn't real." She delivered the words like a closing argument, confident, certain, as if she believed the weight of her conviction could turn lies into truth. I let the silence stretch just long enough before I answered. My voice was calm, measured, steady as stone. "Crystal, I've never manipulated anyone. I invested in companies that were failing and gave them the chance to survive. I chose to live privately. Because I value discretion over publicity, neither of those things is illegal and neither of them is immoral." My gaze held hers, unflinching, and for the first time, I saw the smallest flicker of uncertainty flash behind her carefully composed mask. "You bought my father's company and let him believe he was a failure," Crystal snapped, her composure slipping. I didn't raise my voice. "Your father was failing as a businessman," I said evenly. "I saved his company and protected his employees' jobs." Under his management, Caldwell Tech would have gone bankrupt within months. William, who had been silent until then, cleared his throat. "Mrs. Harper, I respect what you did for the company," he admitted. "But you can't deny you've been strategic about hiding your involvement in our family's affairs." I met his gaze without flinching. "Strategic, yes. Deceptive, no. You never asked, and I had no obligation to volunteer the information." Alan Stone opened a thick folder with a little flourish, sliding pages toward us. "Mrs. Harper, we have evidence that you've used your financial position to influence multiple situations involving my client's family, payments made to Mr. Caldwell through consulting fees, the timing of certain business decisions that impacted their financial stability, even the investigation into my client's personal activities." His tone carried the weight of accusation, as though naming things made them proof. Stephen leaned in, his expression steady. "Evidence of what exactly?" he asked, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. Alan didn't blink. "Evidence of a pattern of control and manipulation designed to maintain power over this family's financial future." I sat back, scanning the faces around the table. People who thought they understood the game they were in, but had no idea how many moves ahead I'd been playing for years. They wanted to paint me as a villain when all I had ever done was protect what I'd built. I folded my hands and let my words come out slow and deliberate. Mr. Stone, let me make something very clear. I don't control your client's family. I don't owe them money. I don't owe them explanations. And I certainly don't owe them access to my assets. That should have been the end of it. But Crystal wasn't ready to let go. She leaned forward, her eyes burning. But you do owe your son honesty, she said sharply, and you owe your daughter-in-law respect. That word, respect, hung in the air like a spark near dry tinder. I felt something cold settle in my chest, not fear, but resolve. They had just crossed a line, and none of them realized how much they were about to regret it. You introduced me as a family embarrassment at your wedding reception. You hired investigators to dig through my private life. You filed complaints with regulators to force me into a settlement. And now you want to lecture me about respect? My words echoed in the room, and then there was nothing but silence. It was the kind of silence that made even the air feel heavy. Everyone froze, unsure if the conversation had just ended or if I'd simply thrown down a new challenge. Chris finally broke the quiet. He had sat through the entire meeting in painful silence, his hands clenched in front of him, his face pale. His voice was tight, but steady. What do you want, Crystal? What would it take to end this? She glanced at Alan Stone, who gave a small nod before she turned her eyes back to me. I want a formal family financial agreement, she said carefully, something that creates clear expectations and responsibilities for all of us. What kind of responsibilities? I asked, though I already had a sinking idea. Alan reached for another folder and slid it across the table. We're proposing a family trust with shared governance and defined distribution policies, he explained smoothly. Mrs. Harper would contribute a substantial portion of her assets to the trust, and it would be overseen by a family board for the benefit of all members. The audacity of it nearly made me laugh. You're suggesting I hand over my money to a committee, I said evenly, a committee that includes people who have been investigating me and filing complaints against me. Crystal's chin lifted a fraction higher. We want a fair arrangement that protects everyone's interests, she replied, her voice brimming with false reasonableness. I rose from my chair and walked slowly to the wide conference room window. Below us, the city moved in its usual rhythm, people rushing to meetings, grabbing coffee, making plans, completely unaware that 20 floors above, a war was being waged over power, trust, and betrayal. I rested my hand lightly on the glass, watching traffic blur in the distance. Then I turned back to face them, my decision sharp in my chest. I have a counterproposal, I said finally. I turned back from the window and faced the room, my voice calm but sharp enough to cut. Crystal, you have 72 hours to withdraw every complaint you've filed with regulators and to stop all investigation into my affairs. In return, I'll give you a settlement that ensures you and your parents can keep your current lifestyle without ever needing to involve me again. The words landed like stones in water, rippling across every face at the table. Alan Stone narrowed his eyes. What kind of settlement are we talking about? His tone carried suspicion, but also a flicker of curiosity. $5 million, I answered without hesitation. One-time payment. In exchange, you all sign agreements that you will never contact me or my son again. The silence that followed was almost physical, pressing down on the room. Chris's head whipped toward me, his voice breaking. Mom, you can't be serious. But I was, dead serious. I had just put a price on freedom, and it was worth every penny. $5 million, Crystal repeated slowly, like she was trying on the words for size. To never contact David again. That's correct, I said, holding her gaze. She searched my face for any sign of bluff, but there wasn't one. This wasn't a threat. It was a solution. Alan's eyes flicked between us, already calculating. He knew as well as I did that $5 million was far more than his client could ever hope to win in court, and it came without years of litigation, without headlines, without risk. "Mrs. Harper," Alan said carefully, "that's a generous offer, but it looks more like an attempt to end a marriage than to resolve a family disagreement." I leaned forward, my hands folded neatly on the table, my voice steady as steel. "Mr. Stone, that marriage was already broken long before this meeting. What I'm offering is a way for everyone to walk away with something instead of nothing. You came here thinking you could take from me. What I'm showing you is that the price of my peace is $5 million and nothing more. I'm simply offering to pay for a clean ending instead of a messy one," I said evenly. That was the moment Chris shot up from his chair, his face red with disbelief. "Mom, stop! Both of you, just stop!" He turned, his eyes sweeping the room with pure disgust. "This is insane. We're sitting here negotiating the price of my marriage like it's a business deal." His words hung heavy, but I met his anger calmly. "Isn't that exactly what it's been?" I asked softly, not to wound him, but to expose the truth none of us wanted to admit. He turned toward Crystal then, his voice breaking in a way that made my chest ache. "Crystal, I need you to answer me honestly. Did you marry me because you love me, or because you thought I came from money?" The silence that followed stretched on so long it felt like the room itself was holding its breath. Finally, she looked at him and said, "David, that's not a fair question." He shook his head slowly, his expression hollow. "It's the only question that matters." I watched his face as he searched hers for an answer, the truth written in everything she didn't say. In that silence, I felt the weight of the last 15 years settle over me. Every choice Tom and I had made, every decision to protect Chris from the burden of our wealth, every secret I had carried to shield him from entitlement, it all crystallized into this single moment. He was finally seeing what I had seen from the start, that his marriage had never been about love, but about calculation. And as much as it broke me to watch him realize it, there was no going back now. $5 million, I said again, this time with steel in my voice, my eyes locked on Crystal. "And on top of that, I'll make sure your parents keep their house and your father keeps his consulting role at Caldwell Tech. You sign the papers, you walk away, and you never come near my family again." The offer sat heavy in the silence, not as a bribe, but as a boundary, a line drawn so clearly even she couldn't pretend not to see it. "And if I refuse?" Crystal asked, her voice sharp but shaky. I smiled then, not out of cruelty, but because, for the first time in this whole ordeal, I felt entirely in control. "Then you get nothing. Your parents lose their house, your father loses his income, and you spend the next several years tangled in legal battles that will cost you far more than you could ever hope to win." Alan Stone leaned toward her, whispering quickly, no doubt spelling out the math she already knew. $5 million in hand now versus years of expensive litigation with no guarantee. Crystal's shoulders stiffened. "I need time to consider this," she said tightly. "You have until noon tomorrow," I replied. "After that, the offer disappears, and so do the protections you're currently taking for granted." When the meeting broke up, the Caldwells filed out first, their faces pale with calculation. Chris stayed behind, hovering near the door, his expression torn. "Mom," he said finally, his voice low, "did you really just buy my freedom from my wife?" I shook my head gently. "No, sweetheart. I just gave you the clarity you needed to make your own choice." He stood there quiet for a long moment before asking, "What if she takes the money?" "Then you'll know exactly who she was," I said softly. "And if she doesn't?" He swallowed, waiting. "Then you'll still know who she was. And either way, I'll make sure she regrets trying to manipulate this family." He looked at me then with something I'd never seen before, admiration laced with fear. "When did you become so ruthless?" I thought about it honestly. "I think I always was, Chris. I just never had a reason to show it until now." The answer came the next morning. At 11:47 a.m., Alan Stone called Stephen Grant to accept the settlement. By 5 o'clock, the papers were signed, the funds transferred, and Crystal Caldwell vanished from our lives as if she had never existed. Chris filed for divorce the following week, citing irreconcilable differences. It was brutal, but it was clean, and for the first time in months, I felt like the storm had finally passed. 6 months later, on a quiet Sunday evening, my phone rang. It was Chris. "Mom," he said, and I could hear a new lightness in his voice. "I met someone. Her name's Sarah. She's a teacher, and she has no idea you're wealthy." I smiled into the receiver. "How do you know?" He chuckled. "Because when I told her my mom lives in a nice apartment and drives a reliable car, she said that sounded like a woman who's got her priorities straight." Something in my chest finally loosened, tension I hadn't realized I'd been holding for years. "She sounds perfect," I said. "When do I get to meet her?" "Next Sunday," he answered. Then after a pause, "But Mom, when we have dinner, can you just be the woman who raised me to work hard and respect people? Can you leave the corporate mogul at home?" I laughed, the sound full and real. "Of course, sweetheart." "But if she's secretly investigating our family finances, all bets are off." He laughed too, and for the first time in a long time. I believed the future was just as bright as Tom, and I had always hoped it would be. And if you've stayed with me through this whole story, I want to hear what you think. Would you have done the same in my shoes or handled it differently? Drop me a comment below. Let me know your thoughts. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe. It really means the world to me. I love knowing where you're listening from, so tell me in the comments, and let's keep this conversation going.